want to make 6 points about the consumer price index. First point to ask about it is to say, well, what are we going to put on this grocery list and then what are we going to put in this basket of goods? And statisticians and economists try and put the typical items of a typical household. But this can lead to kind of odd situations. For example, some of the items they might put on the list would be things like electricity and apartment rent, haircuts, a whole variety of items. But take a look at this apartment rent example. Well, what happens if people live in a house? They don't pay a rent. Well, nevertheless, there has to be a portion for apartment rent. Funeral services. Well, what if nobody died? Well, again, diapers. What happens if there's no family? Nevertheless, when we say a typical household, we mean the average of all households in Canada. And as they say, the typical family, 2.3 kids, doesn't really exist. In fact, an example of this would be gasoline and metro tickets. The grocery list or the basket of goods in Canada contains both the cost of a metro ticket and also the cost of gasoline. Some people don't own a car. They never buy gasoline. Other people never take the metro because they drive their car everywhere. So the list is an average. The real question here, though, isn't so much what to put on the list, but really what proportion or what weight to give to each item. So, for example, here I've got a household, 20% on rent, or maybe let's call it housing services, 15% for food, so much for clothing and so on. Now, some people spend a lot on their phone. I don't. So really for Statistics Canada, the problem is to determine what percentage for each item the disposable budget, or the amount of money people spend per month, let's say, on different items. And this is where the average comes in. And so what Statistics Canada does is they collect data, particularly in the base year, where they look at households and find out what proportion of their income they spend on different items, create an average across Canada. Well, actually, they do it for each province and then create an average for all of Canada together. So it's possible that you can see the breakdown. Statistics Canada publishes this, the portion of each budget in each province that's spent on different items. And it's different. Different provinces, people in different provinces spend their money slightly differently. Which leads to an interesting question. This isn't directly related to the Consumer Price Index. In fact, it's a broader question, but it is it's a problem for Statistics Canada in determining the typical basket of goods, or rather the weights for different items. And this refers to a way of classifying goods, and specifically, the question of how do rich people and how do poor people spend their money? That is to say, what portion of their budget do they devote to different things? Keep in mind, too, we're not talking about saving here. It's likely that rich people save more than poor people, but we're looking at how people spend their money, so we're looking at consumption goods. You may have seen this before. I think in sociology, there's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is completely arbitrary. It's based on the concept that certain items are really important, so those are the first things that a family would purchase, or an individual would purchase, and then as you go up, presumably you have more discretionary income, you buy other things. Incidentally, there's an economist, I think Belgian, at the end of the 19th century, who did studies. They actually went into households and looked at what they purchased. And so in economics, we refer to this as Engel curves. What we're looking at here is an income rises, how do different things change as a proportion of the budget? So let's take a quick idea about this. The general terminology for this is something called an inferior good, where the proportion decreases as income goes up. An example of this would be food. Poor people typically spend as much as 50 or 60% of their budget on food. Rich people, it's closer to 10 or 15%. So that means to say, as your income goes up, you may buy a little bit more food, but it takes up a proportionally smaller portion of your budget. Normal goods are things that where the percentage stays relatively constant. So as you get richer, you still spend. Housing is an example. It's around 20%. So poor people spend about 20% of their budget on housing, and rich people do the same. And of course, then the question, well, how does that happen? Someone like Bill Gates, how can you have in part, you can have a bigger house, but more significantly, you can have more than one house. So that means to say that rich people typically will have a house, say, in Montreal, then they'll have a place north of Montreal, a chalet of some sort, and then you may even get a condo in Florida. Bill Gates obviously has houses in different cities around the world. So it remains about 20% of their income. Then finally, you have to have what we call a superior good, or sometimes called a luxury good. In effect, if you have an inferior good that's taking up a smaller proportion of your income, well, then you've got to have something that takes up a larger share. It could be something like, say, cosmetic surgery or orthodontics, uh, travel. Travel is a good example where Bill Gates probably spends more on travel than a portion of his budget anyway than poor people do. Of course, this too. You need a very good theory in economics, or I guess in psychology or sociology, to be able to predict which items are which, and these are going to change according to times and fads and fashions and so on. As I say, this is an empirical study. We're looking at the past. Food likely is going to stay constant. This is something you observe across different cultures and so on. It's very interesting to look at this. And while it's empirical, some are relatively constant, and they can be a little bit surprising. Charity is a normal good. Health care is also a normal good. Third point. This is a precise problem of the CPI is that over time you get new goods or new products, and of course the quality of some products changes. So we're stuck in Canada with the a base year of 2002. I say stuck with it, chosen, but in that time, 2002 people didn't have Netflix. Well, they had Netflix, but you had to have them mailed to you, and Blu-ray. And Blu-ray players, I believe, came around 2010, but they didn't exist in 2000. They may have existed in 2002. A phone today is not even the same as 5 years ago, let alone 2002. So as a result, Statistics Canada has to cope with this problem. One way to do this is to change the base year, which they do periodically, but then that kind of defeats the purpose of this idea of having a set basket of goods. Another solution, of course, is to choose a basket of goods that is non-changing, like milk or butter or some basic food items. But that doesn't work either because you really want to have a broad base index. So sometimes what they use is called a chained index, which means that they change it progressively a little bit year after year. There's something called a hedonistic index. You get into a variety of solutions, but then, as I say, this means that the CPI doesn't measure exactly the change in prices. This is another important one to think about, is that people tend to be they're smart shoppers. If something's on sale that week, you buy less of it. This is the law of demand. Whereas the price checkers are stuck with the exact list. So, for example, in my household, if chicken is on sale one week, well, that's what we're going to be eating. If fish is on sale, we buy fish instead. Think of gasoline prices. We've seen them change considerably in the last few months. If gasoline is cheaper, people often fill up their car. If gasoline is expensive, well, one thing you could do is start taking the metro, or move closer. Over time, it's easy to adjust. You might move closer to where you work, so you don't have to commute as much. So these are all examples where, in effect, the average person can, in effect, be a smart shopper and adjust their purchases according to price changes. Keep in mind, the principle of the CPI is that there's a single list that was created in 2002, and that's the list that's being used year after year. So, in effect, the basket should change to reflect these price changes, but to doing that would mean that the CPI would be inexact. The effect of this is that economists have argued that the CPI probably overestimates inflation or price changes because the average person can do better than the price checkers. Another important aspect of the CPI, sometimes referred to as COLA, or the cost of living allowance or cost of living adjustment. And what this refers to is the idea that many payments are indexed. This is the term that's used, indexed to the CPI. And the logic here is that in some cases we want the payment to increase or to change as the CPI changes. So take a very, very precise example. Retired people on a pension of some sort, often referred to as a fixed income, their pension might go up when the CPI goes up. And the logic of it is that people that are retired should be able to go to a grocery store and have enough money to be able to purchase the same amount of items each year as prices change. And so, which is fine, but it's not simply pensioners. There's many other payments that are attached or indexed to the CPI. And so the end result of this is that for the government, one single decimal place difference in the CPI can lead to, in the case of the U.S. federal government, billions of dollars of payments. And keep in mind, too, that this is going to be continuous over time. So then the CPI becomes, in effect, politicized. A government that wants to limit its expenditures can simply turn to the statistical agency and say, can you kind of err on the side of 0.7 instead of 0.8? And we know that this will save us X amount of, or we'll be able to limit our budget payments X amount. This is going to be particularly true when prices are changing a lot, and then people are frequently looking at the CPI to find out how much extra money they're going to receive and whether it's sufficient for the price changes. When inflation is low, this isn't a major issue, but when prices change, then it is. Something else, a term that you'll hear frequently is the idea of core inflation. The point here is that economists have noticed, of course, that energy prices, gasoline in particular, but food in general also, are volatile. These prices change significantly. And so as a result, the CPI can go up and go down month by month. And as a result, the Bank of Canada, from the standpoint of macroeconomic theory, looks more likely at something referred to as core inflation, which is an index that ignores energy and food, so that it's more basic. But what this raises, in fact, is the idea that for the vertical axes of a macroeconomic model, we want a measure of inflation. Change in the CPI is one. The Bank of Canada will probably be looking at it, and the Department of Finance and Audit, but these are the main instruments of macroeconomic policy, are probably going to have a much broader base or different measures of inflation. They need some measure of it. In this simple model I'm presenting to you, I'm going to be choosing the change in the CPI because it just keeps things simple. Which kind of raises another question about other measures. Let me call this 0.7 here, but other measures of inflation quickly. There's something called other than the core inflation, there's something called the GDP deflator, which in effect we've already seen. The idea there is simply to put everything the country produces, including things like, say, bricks or cruise missiles or submarines or parts. These are things that the government buys or firms may buy. McDonald's going to build a restaurant. Keep in mind that the CPI only includes items that a typical household would purchase. Imported goods would be included in GDP, imported goods would not, so on. So, as I say, the Bank of Canada, the Department of Finance would be using other things like core inflation or GDP inflator for CPI, all as a measure of looking for weights of inflation. More interesting one is this idea of a Google price index, or think of eBay or Amazon. Amazon now, and this has changed over the last 10, 20 years, have access to a whole variety of prices from the items that are sold, and they have this in real time. So there's some discussion about maybe having a different way of going about calculating this price index rather than using price checkers or going to stores and look at items. It could be done through the internet somehow. I want to finish this last kind of quick question here. But, well, who likes inflation? And the opposite of inflation is deflation. That would be when prices are going down. Who would like deflation? Well, consumers generally wouldn't like inflation. That means you have to pay more money when you go to the store to buy things. But then you'd argue in the same hand that maybe the store owners like inflation because that means they receive more money. But it's generally true that most people don't like inflation. And and partly the reason for this is that if you think about it, when prices are going up, the money you hold, the cash you're holding, loses value. And so that makes money into something called a hot potato. But and we'll be looking at this a little bit later in the course. But another way to think about it too is to say, think about it. If you have a large debt, then you might enjoy inflation because you'll be paying back your debt in the future with money that has less value. So if it's easier to get a hold of this money, then in effect, the debt will be eliminated or lowered in any event. So we could look at it from the perspective of people that have borrowed and people that are lenders, how they'd view inflation. But again, this is off in the future. We'll look at this later.